Morning everybody, thanks for coming to spend some time with me this morning. So I'll give you a little bit of background to myself and how I ended up at this point in a few minutes, but just wanted to kind of tee up the session, and this is the first time that I've presented some of this stuff to a room of people, so there's always a level of excitement as we kind of drop some new ideas in. It's a bit of an insight into where my current thinking is at, and the context that I come to this in is relatively unique from having straddled both worlds of rehabilitation and strength and conditioning, both professionally and personally. Essentially, when we're talking about reconditioning, this gap between where I see rehabilitation and performance, we're talking about this performance-orientated approach to rehabilitation following an injury. That's coined a little bit from Bill Knowles' work, if you've kind of followed any of his practices over the years. We've kind of thinking specifically around the shoulders, and when in my business at Dynamic Shoulders, we effectively work with athletic and active people who want to live, train, and compete with confidence. So the reason for this slide is that my belief in what I want to kind of put forward for you today is a bit of a rethinking opportunity. Hopefully on the drive home, there'll be some things to kind of just to process, and then when you get back in with your athletes tomorrow or next week, there's going to be some practical takeaways at the end of the session that you can start playing around with straight away. But this idea that I believe with the way we prepare, rehabilitate, and train the shoulder needs to evolve. And the reason for the AI-generated image that I chose to put up is that I feel like I'm making a case. And what I want to do today is kind of break that case down. So if somebody, based on argumentation theory, is going to propose something, a claim, it is on the person making that claim to back it up. That's the burden of proof. So today should feel fairly logical, principle-based for the first half of the session. And then the second half, I'm going to show you some videos, some of the stuff that we do. I think there's lots of good practice that happens in physiotherapy. We often see, I think, the shoulder through a control-focused lens. When we look at strength and conditioning, we're good at getting people strong, and we often see the shoulder through a strength lens. It's governed by strength. What I'm going to kind of break down and go through today is I actually think we need to take a view of the shoulder through a lens of a skill-based joint. And this is a snapshot to fill that gap in between the two. So to give you some background, I've been a strength and conditioning coach for the last 18 years. The last 5 years have been focused solely on shoulder reconditioning. The reason for that, and probably more interesting to go through who I've worked with over the years, is that I've actually dislocated my shoulder 6 times and had 2 surgeries. So that's the unique perspective that I put myself in around this, as I've been through the process of dislocating, rehabilitating, having a surgery, being told that I'm good to go, going back to play rugby, which is what they said I was able to do, dislocating my shoulder again, having another surgery. That was five dislocations, 2 surgeries, both Bangkok repairs, and then I dislocated my shoulder again, snowboarding a year after the second surgery. And at that point, I've got 0 interest in going back for another surgery. Has anyone had a shoulder surgery, dislocation, Bangkok repair, Latarjets in here? A couple of people. How did you find the rehab? It's savage, right? You can't do anything. Like you can't, if you have a lower body injury, you can go and do upper body in the gym still. With your shoulder, you can't deadlift, you can't back squat. You're basically confined to leg press and some basic core exercises. My strength and conditioning career was also starting to kind of pick up around that time. So I was like, I'm going to combine my professional experience with this problem that I've got that I don't trust my shoulder at all. So my thought experiment was, I'm going to teach myself to do a handstand, because if I could do that, I thought I would have some confidence in my shoulder. Now, I'd never done any gymnastics before. I don't have any kind of, what we would call it, creative arts movement style background. I'm coming at it as a rugby player with a busted shoulder. So flipping myself upside down to balance on my hands was a fairly big ask. I had previously dislocated on my UKSCA lifting workshop with Gil Stevenson doing an unloaded snatch balance, press the bar and slip through. Fortunately, there was a physio on the course who put my shoulder back in for me. And what do you do in those scenarios when you're a rugby player trying to be a strength and conditioning coach? Well, you just carry on lifting for the weekend. And that was kind of like my mentality, you just keep on going. So I've made all the mistakes that a lot of your athletes will have made. So this is coming from a place of going, right, we can probably do a little bit better. So what I found was that we have this issue. And hopefully this will resonate a little bit, because you'll both, from a physiotherapy and strength and conditioning perspective, see it from both sides of the fence. We end up with a lot of people finding themselves having had an injury, and then we can get themselves back to a place here. And that's often where we kind of go, right, we're good. We've passed our protocols. We've been through the process. You're good to go. So we release them from physiotherapy back into a strength and conditioning environment. The problem is, as somebody who's had a dislocation or some kind of repeating shoulder injury, that we are really fearful that at some point we are going to find ourselves back into a place of injury. How many players do you work with now that are compromised but not entirely broken? They won't tell you that there's a problem because they want to play. They don't want to miss matches or training. But there's lots of people out there that have got these grumbling shoulders. If they've had an instability history in the past, it's not been dealt with properly, that is always a consideration in their mind. And for those of you guys who have dislocated shoulders before, you'll know what that lack of confidence feels like. It's a memory, right? And it doesn't go away particularly easily, particularly if it's been repeated. So my whole point around my philosophy and approach was, how do I move myself away from the cliff edge to give myself that confidence that I can do the things I want to do, live the life that I want to live? So my question then was, where do we go to bridge this space? Now, there's loads of good stuff that happens in physiotherapy. If you go to that literature, we've got lots of practices and principles that we can hang our hats on, and we are confident about how to get people to a place where they are cleared. Let's call it that. Then we go to a strength and conditioning program. You've been cleared by the physiotherapist. Coming back into my world now, we're going to bench press, overhead press. We're going to go back into our S&C type activities. But in that system, what I find is that we get loads of people that keep falling through the gap. And we see those now, right? So you can say, like, my last shoulder dislocation was 2014. You go, we definitely have come a long way since then, Tim. Well, we specialize in shoulder reconditioning, and every single week we speak to people who are having the same problem that I had 10 years ago. So I don't know that we've actually made that much ground forwards in bridging this gap, making that connection between the physiotherapy practice and the strength and conditioning. We have great knowledge in each discipline, but something's fallen apart. So let's just frame this very broadly, and you know, you can go to literature and there's so many different stats that we could get on different populations, but let's just broadly go and contextualize. If we are talking about overhead sports, and you go swimming, cricket, volleyball, handball, some of the studies that we have a reasonable amount of data on, 30% is going to be typically the prevalence of shoulder injuries across that broad spectrum. So it's a broad number, but relevant. So 30% are in those overhead sports. The bit that is more tricky is these guys. So this study was a systematic review, but the instability recurrence in 15 to 25-year-olds from a non-operative approach to shoulder instability is 51%. A British Elbow and Shoulder Society would suggest that if somebody dislocates their shoulder under 20 years old, they have a 72% chance of instability, of recurrence. If you start talking about some of the contact sports, we put people back into rugby, we might be talking as much as 80 to 90% chance of redislocation. So the question there is, like, do we just accept that? That's the way that it is, or what are we proactively doing to try and change that narrative? And then this is the one that people don't really talk about. This study was on the return to play following a surgical intervention for shoulder instability. 85% of people who chose not to return to sport cited psychological reasons behind the why. That's in contrast to 65% for the ACL. Just think about the job of the shoulder. It's to position the hand in space. It's a super important task for the brain. It's a joint which we're going to go through in a minute, which has a high amount of mobility and therefore a minimal amount of stability. The psychological impact connected to a shoulder dislocation is significant, and that's particularly relevant when we think about, well, how are we actually preparing that shoulder to go back into positions where it feels vulnerable and exposed in chaotic environments like a contact sport. So thinking, just carry those things through, particularly around that instability and the confidence, the psychological impact of a shoulder issue. I'm going to tee this up a little bit, and this will be for the older generation in the room. Some of you guys might not even remember Windows 95, but it was a pretty big moment, similar to the launch of AI. We had an operating system for the first time. We had these little kind of 3.5-inch floppy disks we used to put in. If you had a big game, a good game, it was 12 disks, one at a time. It took flipping ages for it to do anything. But this quote is from Adam Grant's book, Think Again. It's a really easy, nice, almost like a blog style around rethinking what we think we know and the power of what we don't know. Very kind of like leading towards how we think as scientists anyway. But his quote in this is that you would laugh at somebody who's still using Windows 95. But we are often still utilizing practices that were formed around the same time. And for a few years now, I've kind of stood up in presentations like this and proposed that I think that some of our lower body training practices have influenced what we do for the shoulder. We've almost taken it verbatim and put it onto the shoulder. But I've never actually gone back and quantified it. So even if we think that doing something back from 95 is a little bit of a stretch, what if we went back to 81 years to find out where some of our strength training principles came from? So I went a little bit into the rabbit hole on this one, and I'm not sure that all my dates are exactly correct, but the timeline will tell the story which we're trying to put out, which is we need to rethink how we train the shoulder. So progressive overload and strength development is not a new concept, right? The first documented story, maybe myth around this, is around Milo of Croton. This was the guy who was an Olympic wrestler, very successful. He carried a calf on his back every day for 4 years in training for the Olympics. As the calf got heavier, he got stronger, and that was a simple kind of progressive overload was effectively born. We kind of fast forward a little bit through to 1900, we start seeing barbells, we start seeing strongmen at circuses, and we've got this kind of physical culture which is probably developing largely through trial and error. We don't really have a well-documented emergence of reps and sets and principles until Thomas DeLorme in 1945, and this was a guy who was rehabilitating knees of injured soldiers when they came back from the war. He was a strength athlete himself, so he took what he was experiencing, his trial and error, and then started applying it onto knees. Got better results than what everybody else was getting, and all of a sudden we have now some variables of which we can utilize to improve strength, as raw as they were. We then go through the latter half of the 1950s into the 2000s. We've got a big emergence of bodybuilding culture. Often things are being done in straight lines. And then around the 2000s, we've probably got this time where rep ranges are codified and become a little bit more set in stone, probably by some of the strength training organizations. We now have variables for maximal strength, hypertrophy, what we're going to do from an endurance perspective. And then we go into 2021, where the likes of Brad Schoenfeld have done some work, and all of a sudden we don't think we have to train to failure anymore, and hypertrophy can be gained over a wider rep range rather than just 6 to 8s, for example. But if we go back in all of this, the principles, I think, have developed from the lower body, and we haven't thought about how we then apply them onto the shoulder. It's not that people never trained the shoulder during that time, of course they did, but I don't know that we ever took the time to understand why it might need to be different. And this is just a quick picture of DeLorme testing his knees. He was also a powerlifter himself. Gone are the days where you can train in your pants, which I think is a good thing. So the question then being that I'm going to put out as the first one to reflect on is, do we apply lower body thinking to upper body training? But oftentimes people go, yeah, it's a ball and socket joint. All right, perfect. All right, quite different though. So if we take the hip, we've got this pretty deep acetabulum. Right, we've got the femoral head sits nicely into that. We've got a high amount of contact surface around the joint. Does anybody know anybody who's dislocated a hip? One person, yeah. Yeah, I've actually dislocated mine, which is a good other story. But how about people you know who have dislocated a shoulder? Way more, all right? So straight away we're going, okay, these two things aren't the same. So around the hip, we've got this joint capsule which is designed for stability. We've got a ton of ligamentous tissue and some big strong muscles to keep that thing in place. It's not a joint which dislocates easily. It's a load-bearing joint. We can put force through that joint. When we take the shoulder, what we now have is a humeral head which is 3 times bigger than the socket that it sits on. We've got a joint capsule which is designed for mobility, because it's the job of the shoulder is to position the hand in space, and where we can position the hand is important to the brain from a functional movement survival perspective. Because we have that high level of mobility, we have very minimal static structure to keep that thing in place. The scapula is going to move. We've got a combination of 4 joints. Just by that alone, you go, well, maybe the shoulder needs something a little bit different to the hip. If we then go and add another layer on, let's talk about the importance of the kinetic chain from a shoulder perspective. If we, depending on which papers we look at, 80% of the force developed through a throwing action is going to be developed from the lower body and the trunk. 50 from the lower body, 30 from the core, let's say, and then 20% from the shoulder. So we know that we have to be able to generate and transfer forces, otherwise the shoulder is going to have a tough time. The story I tell always about this one is we were working with a CrossFitter. This guy was into weightlifting. So he came in and he tested, we had all our objective data, we looked at him move, the shoulder generally stacks up pretty well. We put him onto a single leg, and this guy is absolutely hideous. He's all over the place. So our protocol, our programming there is we need to do some lower body work in order to help you to transfer the force, because when you're in your snatch position, you're going to bring it through. If you're not generating force from the ground up, you still want to find a way to get that 70 kilos overhead, or whatever it might be. So the brain's like, all right, and we're going to go and rifle up through the shoulder. So now we're getting a ton of subacromial pain. So we're offsetting the shoulder issue further down the kinetic chain in order to get the performance that we're after. And then we think about how these joints are going to stack together, right? So we've got the hip, the spine position here is going to affect ribcage position. Ribcage position is going to affect the interface with the scapula, whether we've got a flat thoracic spine or more curvature. And then the movement of the scapula is then going to be in response to whatever the task is that we're doing with the hand. So now all of a sudden we've got this big system that we're going to try and connect together. And then if we go in local, all of these muscles acting on the joint, and this is just the scapula and the humerus, for example. We've also got the clavicle in there as well. So there's a significant amount of forces working to control and position the shoulder through the various different things that we want to be able to do with it. So when I say, you guys know Ian Horsley, I was chatting to him about this a few years ago, and he said to me, neuromuscular control is all we've got when you come to the shoulder. And for a lot of times, actually, like, you can have shoulders that are pretty banged up. Like, mine would be a good example. I've had 2 repairs on it, and I've dislocated since my last repair. So let's assume that there's probably a labral tear going on, maybe a Hill-Sachs lesion. But if my ability to be able to maintain the position of the humeral head in the socket is good, and I can do that under progressive intensities, under a range of different movement patterns, I can probably get away without any problems. Like, I haven't had any feeling of instability in my shoulder since I started to learn to handstand. That's a fairly big ask given the fact that I got back to doing human flags and all sorts of stuff. And the point on that first slide that I forgot to mention was that human flag is done on my left arm, which is my dislocated side. So it's the shoulder which is taking all of the load through that pattern. It's the bit where if you work with unstable shoulders, we don't like this shape. This is where we feel vulnerable, right? Those of you guys that have done it. So if I can go and load through into here, and I can go and pull the rest of that chain up to make that whole position, I've done something pretty remarkable from a shoulder reconditioning perspective. And this is where we start playing around with the ideas over the years through another business that I have called School of Calisthenics, but now bringing it into more of a rehabilitation and sports performance conversation. So the way that I'm now seeing the shoulder is that it's a skill-based joint, and we can get bogged down in the semantics of what do we mean by skill. I'm going to come to that in a little while. But when you start to think about everything that needs controlling, strength is important, but timing arguably matters more. Coordination, task specificity, context specificity, the interaction between the scapula, the humerus, the rib cage, the trunk. It's not just a strength problem or a mobility problem or a control problem, it's an all of those problem. And this is not me saying don't train strength. Like, I want athletes in the gym lifting heavy weights. Remember, the bit that I'm positioning this is where does physiotherapy and strength and conditioning overlap? And when I showed that timeline, the cliff image at the beginning, I don't see it anymore as like 2 different disciplines. It's one line. And what we need is strength physiotherapists to move more towards the middle, more progressive understanding of how we place the shoulder under load in this context of skill-based joints. It fits in really well with the principles that you are already prioritizing with your rehabilitation strategies. But I also think strength and conditioning coaches need to come back and understand a little bit more around how the shoulder works and where our loaded strategies are there. When I show you some videos in a while, you're going to look at that, and both parties, I hope, will be, do you know what? That ticks boxes for both sides. And if we can do that, then we've done something which is of value, because you'll see how we can kind of merge those 2 things together. So this is where I'm going to stretch a little bit. I'm going to bring together a couple of principles that we see from a motor control, skill acquisition type conversation, and also what we might see from a rehabilitation and guarding perspective. And those 2 things are going to interlink fairly nicely as we go through. So let's kind of set this up. The shoulder has more degrees of freedom than any other joint in the human body. We have lots of movement options, and high quality movement looks like our ability to be able to organize those different degrees of freedom in lots of different ways to achieve a task outcome based on the context specificity. In a skill, when you're learning a new skill, we freeze degrees of freedom. It's a way for the brain to simplify the movement. So if you go and learn to play tennis for the first time, which I am doing against my wife, who is very good, I am super robotic. I've got 0 amounts of flow and elegance in my tennis. Flip through to somebody who's very good at tennis, and they can hit the same ball multiple different ways to get a different outcome based on all the different conditions, and that just looks effortless, right? It's graceful. It requires less effort, and that's what movement should look like. But to begin with, we have this freezing, guarding, options are limited. And we'll see that in the shoulder also from a rehabilitation perspective. We had a client in week before last who had injured his shoulder, and he comes in and he's like, he cannot get past 90 degrees of abduction, the same into flexion pattern. but passively he can go there without pain. So we start playing around with a few things, we give him a few better strategies, give him a bit of cueing, and all of a sudden he's got back overhead. So this shoulder will go, but the brain is protecting it because it's fearful. There's an injury history there, and it's removing degrees of freedom so that it can control it and keep everything safe, right? Remember, the brain's number one objective is survival, therefore threat perception is of a high order on that spectrum. It's going to very, very quickly take strategies in order to reduce a threat so that we can maintain existence and survival. So our next step, and we often do this really well with an injured shoulder, is we start to give the shoulder some strategies. We start to look at control. All we did with the guy that came into the clinic the other day was we give him a bit more focus on how to get that scapula rotating upwards around the rib cage. We try a few different progressions, and all of a sudden we're freeing now, and we're getting more range of motion back. Now, typically, this is where rehab often stops. And I'm not talking to you guys maybe well beyond where I'm already at, but my experience of where I ended up, and then also the people that we work with who can't get back to sport, it stops at a point where I can balance a stability ball on my hand with my eyes closed or whatever it might be. Like, I got world class at that after my last surgery. I was very good. But then my job is, or what I want to do, is to go back to playing rugby. So now I need to go and hand off a guy who's coming towards me. I'm 78 kilos, this guy's now 100 kilos. I've now got to try and organise that under very different conditions than lying on the back and balancing a ball. And I'm not being dismissive at all about rehabilitation. I'm just teeing it up and going, we need to think a little bit further, because oftentimes the exposure that we are giving athletes around intensity does not prepare them for the chaos. But we're also not doing that in a strength and conditioning context either. So if we stop there, but we understand that actually starting to explore different degrees of freedom, improving range of motion, what if we carried on? What if we kept on freeing? If we pursued more athleticism around the shoulder, and in doing so, exposing ourselves, or the athlete, to more degrees of freedom. We have all of this stuff the shoulder can do, but yet a lot of our stuff in the gym happens here. And if we do want to go out here, we actually don't have that many ways to load it. So we can never really expose it to feeling confident in these kind of positions. Serving, I was chatting to some of the guys yesterday about volleyball. Okay, the ball is going to come through all the different conditions. How many movement options can I get? How many ways can I hit that ball? And this is about athletic performance, but I also think that the shoulder is more robust when it has more movement options and it's exposed to more intensities, because it's then better and able to handle the demands that we want to place upon it. So if we carried on down that, we get to a place where we've got a shoulder which has way more athleticism. It has lots of movement options. The brain has a ton of context. It's been in lots of different positions and patterns before, and therefore it can choose the strategy that it wants based on the context specificity that we find ourselves in. So not only are we starting to make athletes more robust, and I'll show you how we do that in a second, but when I was working at para-swimming, I started to use this type of thinking to get the guys doing handstands. Because we know that the areas of the brain will develop based on the practices, the skills, the movements that we expose them to. So with my swimmers, the guy's first point of contact from a force perspective was going to be in an overhead position. If we took a lower body perspective for that, we would have lots of tools to be able to do that, from around change of direction, acceleration, deceleration. We have very few for the shoulder. So we learned to handstand because I was like, if I can just better wire you to where you are in space, you can then potentially get a better connection with the water. You can then probably also take on cues from your technical coaches better, because you're just able to move, you've got better awareness of where you are in space. So there's loads of benefits that we can talk through around starting to explore this. And if we link it into what we might take as a bit of a skill-based lens, even from outside of just the shoulder, and try and bring these two things together, if we talk about the ability to perceive the environment and effectively act on that perception by making decisions on the choice of techniques required to solve problems. Link that back into what I was saying before about the different degrees of freedom that we have. The more degrees of freedom we have control over, the more potential solutions we can solve. People will go where they feel confident. So if we, without going too much into the weeds, if we take into our skill acquisition, our motor control conversation, and look at contextual variability, because that's effectively what I'm going to go and suggest we do. We're going to go and start disrupting the system and then encourage the brain to find new solutions to those problems. So our contextual variability happening outside the system is something which we are doing to shake and disrupt the system in order to force the motor variability, which is the brain's ability to find a solution based on our ecological dynamics of our organism, our task, and our environment. Right? We shake the system, we destabilize movement, and we're going to get them to find a new movement solution. So shake the system, find a solution, we get self-organization, a new pattern might emerge. I'm going to show you some stuff that we do in a while in gymnastics rings, and there is always going to be that transfer from the gym or the rehabilitation environment into the skill specifics of the sport. I'm not removing that at all. What I'm saying is this is a precursor to that. So we get self-organization, and then we do that more often, and we get to a place of degeneracy where we just have more movement options. It's that same point before that shoulder and that system can choose the option that it wants to execute based on the conditions that it finds itself within. Athletes will act on their perception of what they can do. So those of us that have had unstable shoulders in the past, if I'm a rugby player, I'm going to think very carefully before I go and jackal for the ball, because it's going to put me straight into a position where somebody might come straight through, hit that shoulder, and cause me a problem. So how can we start to expose this? And the confidence point, which I'm going to come back to in a second, is super important on this one. So very simply, if you can move in more ways, then you've got more movement options. And again, just think about the potential benefit around that. But I've got 2 kids. They are 9 and 5. When we teach them vocabulary, or when they're learning to speak, we don't teach them like perfect sentences. Not every sentence that you're ever going to need to use. We teach them words and grammar. They build their vocabulary so that they can construct sentences in the context of what they want to then communicate. I'm seeing this in the same way from a shoulder perspective. Physical literacy, can you move in more ways? And those of you that are also of my generation, born around the 1980s and used to use Windows 95, might have come across Ido Portal. He was the guy who got a lot of heat for training Conor McGregor to move better during Conor's heyday. But if you're not seeing this guy, just go and watch how he moves, like unbelievable mover. But this definition from the NSCA, the ability to repeatedly perform a range of movements with precision and confidence in a variety of environments which require competent levels of motor skills, strength, power, speed, agility, balance, coordination, and endurance. My question is, how good is your toolbox to do that for the upper body? I don't think we've got that many tools to be able to do that. We've got tons for the lower body. We're really good at that. We haven't developed the vocabulary or the skill set to do that for the shoulder. And what I've gone through from a functional anatomy perspective, hopefully that is kind of just prompting a little bit of reflection. So this is how we're going to piece it together halfway through. We position function as the ultimate outcome. I'm interested in what you can do with your shoulder. So can you move it into lots of different positions confidently under more intensities? Because if you can do that, that's how we build confidence. We never build confidence from hiding from the things that we don't feel we can do. We need to kind of push into those. And particularly for those instability clients, those guys that have dislocated, this is where you're going to find your traction. And remember with those guys, particularly for some of the athletes that you're going to be working with, if you are under 20, 21, maybe 22 years old, orthopedic consultants don't want to operate. It's not as simple as getting a dislocated shoulder playing rugby at 15 years old and then having a Bangkok repair or a Latarjet and being absolutely fine for the rest of your career. That's a potentially career-changing injury for people because they can't have a surgery based on the immature skeleton. So we have to then go and find a way that we can start to rebuild that neuromuscular control around the joint. That breeds confidence, and the objective data I position down here, it gives us an insight, it gives us an on-ramp. I roughly know where you're at in various different testing positions. But again, how do we test? Isometrically, stable positions, very safe, through one joint angle, typically. That doesn't look like anything that the shoulder does. So making decisions off this, when this is what actually matters, I think we've got to make sure that we're triangulated. Objective data also serves to build confidence. If athletes can see that their cuff scores, their plyometric push-up scores, whatever test we might be using, have improved, that also goes to build this. And that's probably the real crux of where we want to get to. Loads of function, I feel really secure on my shoulder. Data says I'm good. All right, now we've got a chance of getting back. So as we go into the second half with a bit of practical stuff for you to kind of contextualize, I'm big on this concept of play. Somewhere between our late childhood, let's call it 10 years old, and then 16 to 18, we stopped playing. And play was how we originally learned to interact with the world. It's how we learned about our bodies. Those of you who've got kids will know that. They just learn by moving. It's often a spontaneous, risk-free opportunity to learn. It normalizes risk, improves resilience, and it creates this safe space. So when you drop this stuff in, I'm not suggesting that you go whole hog, completely change everything. The way that I started with this, with the swimmers, was I just had one line on my program that said athletic development. And it was, because it was swimmers, it was shoulder focused. And my focus was, I'm going to teach you something that you can't already do. Anyone work with swimming? The swimmers? Yeah. It's a highly monotonous sport for them, right? So the gym for me was an opportunity to break that. Let's just do something different rather than swimming up and down looking at a black line all afternoon. So this was a fun part. The risk was minimal, and what you'll do when you drop this stuff in is you'll see the athletes start to come on a journey with you. Like, it just breaks the shackles of what training might normally look like. So let's have a look at how we're going to piece it together. I've not got videos for everything just because I was conscious around time. But we start off with one of our kind of onboarding pieces is going to be ground-based movement. So we might use a high hip bear crawl. So rather than going in a flat back position, we're going to get the hips high. That gets my shoulder above 90 degrees, which gets me some more scapular protraction, upward rotation. I'm loading the serratus. I can work forwards and backwards. We're loading. We've got kinetic chain integration. I can play around with the constraints and that to make it more or less challenging. So we might add bands. We might put pauses in. We might do it closed eyes. We've got all of that good stuff, like loads of rehabilitation principles we can put in. This is a crab walk. This one's kryptonite for most people. If they haven't got shoulder extension, we possibly can then start linking in conversations around anterior rotator cuff issues, but they cannot get into these extension patterns. I think a shoulder works well when you have options everywhere. As soon as you lose an option, you force the brain to have to find a different solution, and that solution is probably going to be less effective than option A, the primary one. We lose extension, we're going to have an issue. A lateral bear crawl, really nice little progression pattern, but we just get people into this cross-body position. Those of us that deal with AC injuries, that position is going to be one which we're going to feel pretty ropey in. How else do we load that? Well, we can start doing that on the ground. It's closed chain, we're getting lots of co-contraction, we've got lots of dynamic stability going on. And then the caterpillar will be our walkout with an arm raise. We're going into these longer lever positions. So we can start to tee those patterns up with some very simple movements. They can be done part of a warm-up. It's very low risk. It's very easy to do en masse. And then we go into hand balancing. This was my savior. Learning to handstand, given what I've been through my shoulders, was life-changing for me. So we unpicked it, and given that I'm not from this gymnastics background, so we've got a very sort of like strength and conditioning, exercise progression methodology around how we do it. So we're going to start off, this would be our frog stand, right? So all we're going to do is going to reduce our base of support. And think about our progression here, right? If I can go into a push-up position, and I'm pretty confident there, all I'm doing is bringing the feet in, decreasing my base of support, and having to manage my center of mass over that base of support. It's not that difficult for people to do. What I'm also getting is a neurological challenge. Brain now has to confront, do I trust my shoulder? Because I've got this heightened perception of threat around loading it. I'm now unstable, so let's deal with that a little bit. Now I'm also going to take you upside down, so now I've got a vestibular challenge as well. So my sensory input from a neural perspective is massive. We bend the elbows, we go into external rotation, so we've got a cue up on the shoulder here. I lift my feet off and I find my balance point. This is our reverse gorilla, so I want to get into an overhead position and start getting athletes confident into these overhead positions. Bear in mind with that reverse gorilla crawl, I've already been into this crab walk, into this caterpillar position potentially, so everything is teeing up and leading through. So we're building safe positions here. My hips are pretty high, you can start way lower than that one. We're pressing out overhead, building confidence, it's closed chain again, ticks the physio box, what we're doing from a rehabilitation perspective. And then now we're going to go into a wall walk position. So you can go as far up the wall as you want to in this position. You don't have to go all the way up. But we can start to build confidence progressively. And this bit is where the money is. You start walking back down. That is where you're getting a ton of shoulder dynamic stability and kinetic chain integration. Remember, we're talking about this system. You can, on those wall walks, actually do multiple reps. If you want to go and put some shoulders into a real kind of hold, go and get them to do 3 to 5 repetitions without putting the feet on the floor. And just to show where it goes, that's a position where we can get back to. And we can, if you wanted to go down that route. I'm not saying that everybody needs to go there, but you can see where we start to build those things through. And if I can do this stuff, then my confidence level is potentially a little bit higher. Now, the greatest piece of training equipment for the shoulder is the gymnastics rings. It also happens to be one of the cheapest when we get past the TheraBand territory. You can pick a set of these up for a good set for 35 quid. They are super transportable for training camps, and if you can learn how to use them, you probably don't need a ton more stuff. So we're going to go through a few progressions on this one. I'll take you through, I might play it through twice just so you can see it. Now the key that I'm playing around with here, and you can do it two ways, is I'm not going to rest the ring on my forearm. So now all of a sudden you're going to see my shoulder have to work to stabilize. We can start very easily by packing that in pretty tight, keeping the straps and the rings against the forearm, keeping a strong position. I can also grade that. So it's very easy for me to change intensity by changing the body angle. Watch what happens when we start to play around with not leaning on the straps. It's a significant or constraint for the movement. And then also think about what's happening from a core perspective. The trunk's involved. The scapula is also now going to have to, or be able to, protract around the rib cage, so serratus is going to do a job. If we go back to this constraints based, when we go from a rehabilitation perspective, we go, well, if I put the brain into this situation and go do that pattern, there's no way the brain doesn't go, well, can't possibly use serratus to do that protraction. It will find a way to solve the movement challenge that I'm facing without me having to dial in on the intricacies of can you feel your serratus working. We're then going to start to play around with range of motion. We can turn out at the top, gives me a little external rotation. Now I'm going to go and play out in some positions where I can load wider. I'm low to the ground on here. Don't start here, like when you get into this. These are like fairly aggressive positions. As a tight writer, but the whole time I'm learning to trust that shoulder into the excursions where you don't normally get to go. This is my dislocated shoulder, left side. That's the place no one wants to go to with a dislocated shoulder, under that kind of load. Core's working, we call this a ring reach, trusting my shoulder, and then we play around with the ring sweep. You can see the shoulders having to work hard. But now we're just playing around with, can I get command out of these kind of spaces? So the next time I have to find my way, or find myself out there, or want to put my hand out there, the brain's like, yeah, we're good. I can do this because I've been here before. I know what to do. If I take a knock in that position and I'm confident here, my brain at least has a strategy to kind of go, I know to stabilize that shape. So I've got a better chance potentially of decreasing the risk of a shoulder dislocation or a shoulder injury. If those of you that are working in contact sports, in that early age, 14, 15, 16, that is our window where we change shoulder instability, recurrence rates. Once it's happened, we're in a different kind of conversation. But those of you that are in physio will know Adele Fanning. Adele and I are putting together a resource specifically for the youth contact athlete because we have to fix this problem upstream. We can't wait until it's happened. Super simple to set up. Get a set in your gym, play around them with your own practice first, and then message me and tell me how your shoulders feel when you do it. Into some hanging practice. Those of you, again, so this is the bits of the physio might know Margie Olds. Margie loves this sort of stuff because she's like, in no other way do we actually get to put traction on the shoulder in a rehabilitation perspective. The other great thing about the hanging is that we get to cue some grip strength challenge. We know that grip is directly correlated to cuff function. So the better my grip strength is, or if I can train the grip strength, my theory is that we can then start to really load that cuff at the same time. So we can start these things off pretty basic. It's just an active hang. When we do this one, what I want with the active hang is a straight upwards movement. I don't want a scapular retraction and arch in the rib cage. I just want you to move directly up. So the arms don't bend, scapula comes down. It's kind of the only time we ever recue back and down, to be fair. So we're just going to go through some holds. You can load those. We sometimes would use on fat grips, put a weight vest on, whatever you want to do. Now we can move into some single arm hangs. Now these are difficult. So what we would do to start off with would be to just release one or two fingers off the upright or off the bar. And it might be that we just shift across and hold onto one side for 10 seconds, 5 seconds, whatever it might be. You're gradually exposing that to an isometric contraction at a higher intensity. When we get good at it, we can then start to just take that hand off, go into a single arm hang. The video that comes after that, if you ask your athletes to do a single arm hang, they might be like, flipping no chance, can't do it. If you ask them to do a set of monkey bars, which requires a single arm hang, they'll probably do it because it's a task-based focus. We are giving the brain a job to do, the brain will find a way to do it. Nice, elegant, make it look easy, flow through, mess around with it a little bit, go right now, go backwards. And if you've got these kind of set up in your gym or you can make it off anything else, my job to the athletes now, in my play component, is do it, but do it differently. Do it, but do it differently, repeated. Find a different way to move across that rig. So we're starting to embrace that creative brain a little bit. Think about all the corners of that shoulder range of motion that I'm playing around with that I never get to touch in any of our traditional exercises under significant load. This is figure eights, probably pretty reasonable amount of rotator cuff work going on in there. But let's not also just reduce that down to it's just about the rotator cuff. Remember, the shoulder needs to work as a system, so if pecs and lats and delts and everything else is working in there, then perfect, because that's what it's going to do in a sports context. And then the final one before I just kind of land this and then we can take some questions. We then move into our plyometric or explosive type sessions, right? So the principles being, we've gone ground-based movement. We've then maybe gone into some rings work. I've taken the shoulder out into these positions under progressive intensities, and it's learned to build a motor control strategy under a significant intensity. I've now earned the right to go and play around with some plyometric progressions where I might go and catch wide. So it could be that I go off my plyometric push-up to start off with, keep it safe just in that same realm as my plyometric push-up, and then now I'm going to push and I'm going to go and reach and I'm going to go and catch out. Again, we're just utilizing different positions and progressions to be able to start to load that shoulder under those higher intensity forces or that rate of force development stuff that we want. And then this one here, this like plyo push and catch, that'll be a push-up position, push up, and then you're going to go and catch onto a bench. It's the same as my caterpillar position. And I've done a ton of handstand work in there as well. So I have the strategy, built it up from a skill perspective, and now I'm executing it into something which is more like a sport-specific context. So loads of stuff in there. We do like that rapid, really, anyone kind of like would remember core, I'm flipping old. Athletes performance, core performance, they had this kind of like rapid response kind of stuff. It was like fast foot movements, just to try and drill speed. We use the same thing for the shoulder, so it's can you fast up and down, go as quick as you can for 10 seconds. Doubles. So all the time we've got this really nice little progression through. And the awesome stuff about this is you have to earn the right to progress. The gymnastics rings you can't hide. Athletes can probably find another way to put an extra 2.5 kilos on a bar. I'll find a way to move that weight. On the gymnastics rings, it will expose whatever's weak in the system. You cannot progress. And if I said to you, don't take this away, this is the bit which is like the director's cut. But after my last shoulder dislocation, I did a bout of physio. They said I was good to go. I had zero confidence in my shoulder. I did no rotator cuff exercises from that point onwards and got my shoulder back to where I am with it now and no problems. And the reason being is I just trained bigger patterns. So me going into a human flag, well, you just can't kick up into a human flag. You have to learn to control torso position, push into the bar, create that confidence. So each time I'm earning the right to move to the next level. And as I do that, I then start to build out these movement options that we're talking about. In our practice now, we always have rotator cuff exercise in there. It's probably the fastest and safest route from A to B. But my point being that actually what this stuff does is a constraint in itself is you can't cheat it and you can't hide. So you have to address the weaknesses. And in 18 years as a strength and conditioning coach, if you boil my philosophy down now into one sentence, it's find out where you crap at and train it. That's for the shoulder is typically where our goal is going to be. And exposing athletes to different positions in this kind of work is going to do that. One of the guys that I do some, I say I look after, those of you that like NFL, Jason Bell is an ex-NFL player. He also works for Sky Sports as their pundit, and we chat about athletic training all the time. He said to me once that finding big dudes is not hard. Finding big dudes that are athletic, that's hard. So for those of you sat there being like, oh, look at Tim, he's not very big, his kind of body's pretty well suited to this type of training. I've got a 120 kilo prop, what am I going to do with him? Well, finding big dudes that are athletic is hard, but it's also not impossible. Martin Lichis, world's strongest man, this guy's 161 kg. Anthony Joshua, 2 meters tall, 198 tall, 113 kg. This isn't a great human flag, I'd like to see that arm a bit straighter, but nitpicking. We can do it, and you can take them as far down that road, which is relevant to their sport, their body type, their injury history, their level of progression. And I'm going to land this with 5 minutes to go. This is G. Miles. He was a baseball player and manager, and he said, you can't lead anyone further than you've gone yourself. So my challenge around this is that practitioners will typically prescribe exercises that they are confident in delivering and are in line with their biases. If you like powerlifting or hypertrophy, you're probably going to, if I looked at your program, there's probably a reasonable amount of that type of methodology within it. My recommendation would be, and my training has always been, try it, learn, build my toolbox. It's why I'm not particularly good at anything. It's because my training is like an experiment so that I can use those things with my athletes because I've experienced it myself. You will not prescribe ring exercises if you can't do them yourself. So play around with it, and that's also stress testing what does it feel like? You can gatekeep that before you then go and put it in with your athletes and see if it's appropriate for the guys that you're working with. So, in summary, shoulders need mobility, control, and strength. I'm not taking anything away from improving range of motion. I'm not taking anything away from heavy overhead presses. What I'm saying is this piece in the middle is probably where the gold is, that we don't have a strategy for, and we haven't built a vocabulary and practice around based on the architecture and anatomy of the joint and how the brain is going to utilize the shoulder in real-world scenarios. We need to prepare rehab and train it in a way that promotes athleticism, give people more movement options, and when they are confronted with chaos, and I'm thinking about what contact sport athletes there, there's minimal chaos in a swimming pool, but if we prepare for chaos, and I'm very clear on what my reverse engineered point is, what is success? I'm giving the shoulder a load more strategies to actually handle that and stay more robust and improve performance. You won't know how long it took me to embed these logos into a QR code, so if you snap it, that would make me feel it was worthwhile. So either of those guys, you can get me. That's obviously our Instagram, LinkedIn, I am inconsistent with, but my email address is the one that I would, if you want direct contact, just drop me a message through. 5 minutes, Ralph. Questions? That's what I've got for you today, guys. Hope that was of use.